All right, go ahead and turn your Bibles to John's Gospel. We're starting a new chapter this week. We're starting chapter 7. In the Gospel of John, we are in the midst of the section called the Confession of the Son of God. We've been studying the Confession of the Sons of God here for a while, and it's been revealing to us who he is through discourses. Jesus is teaching about his nature, his character, who he is. That he's God, he's the source of life, source of salvation, he's the judge. And the last time we finished the bread of life discourse, which was part of a greater section that contained the feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, and then the bread of life discourse, all in chapter 6. And what we saw there is that John's presentation, in John's gospel, it focused on the feeding, the walking, the bread of life discourse through an Exodus theme. It gave us an Exodus theme. It presented Jesus as being the second Moses. It presented Jesus as being the true bread that comes out of heaven, unlike manna, which only pointed to the reality that's in Christ. And just like manna gave them physical life and sustenance, Christ gives us eternal spiritual life and sustenance. Also, it presented Christ as the ultimate sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice, through which we must eat of his flesh and drink of his blood, which was metaphors for believing and trusting in him and taking part of his sacrifice. And because of that, many people turned away from it, couldn't handle that teaching, and left. And these events occurred at the beginning of the third year. I've updated this chart slightly, and I'm taking the beginning of the years around Passover. In the Jewish calendar, the Nisan begins the year. It begins the holiday year and the reigns of the king, Nisan, which is equivalent to our mid-March. And Passover is the 15th of Nisan. So last time when we talked about the bread of life discourse, that was here. Right before the third year began, or maybe at the beginning of the third year, depending on how you're going to say it, there was a Passover that happened. And now, if you see, chapter 7 begins at the Feast of Booths. So we're talking about 6 months later. So you can see that John, the author, he skips 6 months of material of Jesus' ministry. And that's recorded a lot in the other Gospels. And he does that because he's writing with thematic purposes. And he's writing to give us certain information and to follow certain trains of thought. And if you notice, the Feast of Booths, it covers chapter 7, verse 1, all the way to 10:21. So this is a large section of when he's here at this feast. And John records multiple speeches and dialogues and discourses that occur during that time. And in the overall structure, we've been talking about the confession of the Son of God because he's revealing himself. But as he reveals himself to be God, as he reveals more of light, there's more that darkness is being exposed, and darkness is rising up because that darkness hates the light. And so, although the larger structural section concerning the controversy over the Son of God, I have it here starting in 8:12, really, it's already begun. We see that happening more and more. And these categories shouldn't be viewed as cut and dry. There's a lot of overlap. It's just that this section focuses more on him revealing himself, and this one emphasizes more on the controversy that is occurring because of his confession and his self-revelation. So this week, because that we're receiving more and more of the light of Christ, of who he is, his self-revelation and his confessions, and the more that light is revealed, the more darkness can truly be seen for what it is. This week I've entitled the passage, Rising Hostilities. John 7, 1 through 13. And in this passage we're going to see two scenes that describe the rising hostilities concerning Jesus, the level of hostility which he is receiving. So as always, let's go ahead and read the entire passage so we can get a context, the full forest view, and then we'll go in and look at each verse. Starting in verse 1, it says, After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was near. Therefore his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples may also see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself is seeking to be known publicly. If you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers were believing in him. So Jesus said to them, "My time is not yet here, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time has not yet fully come." Having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as if in secret. So the Jews were seeking him at the feast, and were saying, "Where is he?" There was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying, "He's a good man." Others were saying, "No, on the contrary, he's leading people astray." Yet, not one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. Okay, the first scene that we see here in this passage is the unbrotherly invitation. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. And it starts off, the first two verses contain the introduction, where we learn about the location and about the timing. The first two verses say, "After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was near." So he was walking up in this region in Galilee. That's where his home base is. His home is instead of in Judea, which is in this section here. The Jews, meaning the Jewish leadership, had authority in Judea. So and because they were seeking to kill him, he stayed out of their region. He stayed and ministered in Galilee. Now when it says, "After these things," we've already seen how this events that are going to occur in chapter 7 happened 6 months after the events that were in chapter 6. And so here we find Jesus in Galilee walking, meaning he was traveling about from town to town, from city to city, ministering, preaching, and probably healing and doing other miracles. And we see that John is specifically telling us, setting us up in this chapter, informing us of the great animosity of the Jewish leadership towards Jesus, that they were decisive concerning who Jesus was and their attitudes towards him. They wanted to kill him. So the Jewish leadership made it unsafe for him to minister in their territory. But the Feast of Booths was near. Verse 2. Now the Feast of Booths was the one out of the 3 Jewish feasts, Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Booths, one out of 3 which all Jewish males were required to go to Jerusalem. They were required to make that pilgrimage. They were required to attend. So you see the conflict here. Would he go back into Judea, into harm's way? Now, as a brief reminder of the Feast of Booths, it really centers on 3 concepts. Number 1 is God's provision. The feast was celebrated after the harvest, specifically of grapes and olives, but other fruits as well, and before the sowing, before the time of plowing and sowing began. So it looked back on the year and it saw God's provision, his blessings in the crops, in animals, in life, in families. And it was a time of giving thanks. If you notice in this calendar, here's the month of Nisan, where the Jewish calendar, as far as the holidays and the kings begin. And we have here Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. Then we have Pentecost here. You can see this is the summertime. Moving down here is a clump, where the 3rd holiday is the Feast of Tabernacles. And then you see here, this is where plowing starts, and the first harvest doesn't happen until Passover. So the first thing that the Feast of Booths emphasizes, because it's at the end of all the harvest, is it looks back on the year of God's provision. Second thing is that it focuses on God's faithfulness. The Feast of Booths is called such because they made tents, booths that they stayed in during this time to commemorate their ancestors who were in the wilderness wanderings, who lived in booths. And therefore it looks back on how God was faithful to them, and then in contrast, how much greater they have it here in the land, how much more God's blessings they receive and they enjoy. And thus it's a contrast. I always say you don't appreciate your house more than when you go camping in a tent in the woods for a couple of days. Then you come back and you see how much you actually have. All the conveniences, all the comforts, all the things. Until you have it rough, you don't appreciate the goodness that you have. So, because it contrasts, it also looks forward to the time of the kingdom, the eternal kingdom, when the Messiah would come and there would be unlimited eternal material blessings. Just how their blessings are far greater than those in the wilderness, the ones in the kingdom will be even greater. So it was a time of looking forward. They called that coming of the kingdom the second Exodus. So you see that theme of Exodus is continuing on. And that's the link in which John is linking chapter 6 and chapter 7. Okay, so first is God's provision, second is God's faithfulness, past, present, and future. And then third, it was a time of seeking God's favor. Because it was at the end of the harvest and before the rainy season, it was a time where they prayed to God for rain and for another year of blessing. Another year of His graces. Now, as you see here, there's 3 holidays there. In that month of Tishri, there is trumpets, which is on the first of Tishri, which is sometimes called the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Memorial, the Rosh Hashanah. Rosh is Hebrew for head or beginning, and the Hashanah, year, or the Jewish New Year. The Feast of Trumpets, it commemorated the beginning of the agricultural New Year, or the civil New Year. We have different years as well. We have an academic year, and we have a calendar year. And even our president starts a different time than the actual calendar year. Same thing here. Trumpets was the beginning of a new year. Day of Atonement was on the 10th. It was sometimes called Yom Kippur, or the fast. It was the time where the sacrifice and cleansing of the nation's sins. It was the only holiday in which the Jewish people had to fast, not eat. The rest of the celebrations were all centered around eating, food, and celebrations. This is one where they fasted and they mourned over their sin. And they fasted for 24 hours, but as soon as that fast ended, they ate in rejoicing. So the Feast of Booths was right after that. It's in the 15th. It's a few days later. The yellow here, the first and last days were holy days. There were no work to be done, just celebration. The Feast of Booths is also called in the Scriptures and in Jewish writings the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of the Lord, or just simply the Feast, or the Feast of Sukkot. And it was the most popular of the feast, the feast that was most well attended. It was very joyous. It was joyous over God's forgiveness and His blessings. So it was at the time where once all of the animals and the harvest were in, people would give their first fruits to God and the priests, but then make their own sacrifices and rejoice before the Lord. And spend their money there in celebration. The ancient texts speak about flute playing. Every day flute playing, even during the Sabbaths and the festival days when normally they couldn't, there was flute playing. And ancient writers say, if you never experienced the tabernacles rejoicing and flute playing, you don't know what rejoicing is. And we know they sang the Psalms, a lot of the Psalms, the Hallel Psalms, and some of the other Psalms were sung there. And according to Leviticus 23, it commands that the men build a structure called a booth or a tabernacle, a temporary shelter. And they were to decorate it or make it out of myrtle, citron, palm, or willow branches. And so therefore there was kind of almost an annual pruning that was going on. They would bring these things in. This is just a modern example of what they do currently, either making a whole structure out of these things, or these are balconies where they make little tent structures, and sometimes they would decorate it with branches. But the men in that time, in the first century, they would sleep in these temporary shelters in fields, in the streets, on the town square. Some of them built them on top of the roofs. Remember, the buildings had for the most part, had flat roofs. They could build that tent up top there. And they would remind them of the conditions of their forefathers as they lived in the wilderness, in contrast to the blessings of the lands there. But in either place, it showed and reminded them of God's blessings and his faithfulness. Also commanded in Leviticus 23 is to have this bouquet of myrtle, citron, palm, and willow branches, which is called the lulav. And then also to have a citron fruit, which was called the etrog. If you look at the pictures here, this became a very prominent Jewish symbol. When we think of Judaism, we think of Star of David or menorah. But if you can see here, this is a mosaic where you have the menorah, you have the incense shovel, you have the trumpet, the shofar. But right here, that's the lulav. That's the branches that are tied together. And that little thing right there is the citron. You can see in modern day here, in front of the Wailing Wall, you see a man. He's holding the citron fruit and his lulav. This is a coin from 135, from the Bar Kokhba Revolution. But you see right here is that lulav bouquet, and here's the citron. It's because of Bar Kokhba, Bar means son, Kokhba, son of the star. He was supposed to be a messianic figure. It didn't go very well. Rome really destroyed them. But surrounding the coming of the Messiah, the kingdom, the blessings, was the time of the Feast of Booths. It reminded them of that. And that's important for us to know as we enter into this passage. So in addition to these things, during this week, there were special ceremonies that happened almost every day that focused on God's future provision of rain in the next year and his light that was a light to the world in the Jewish nation. And we're going to discuss those later because the passages that we're going to cover specifically refer to them. So what you need to know that this was an immense party before the Lord. Okay, that brings us to our second point, which is a request of Jesus' brother, verses 3 through 5. Now, so the introduction in verses 1 and 2 provided a conflict. Okay, it told us of the danger in Judea, that they wanted to kill him, and yet it told us that this is the timing of the required feast of the Feast of Booths, that all the Jewish males, including Jesus, to be obedient to God, were required to go into Judea. So that brings us to the request. Verse 3 through 4 says, "Therefore his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go into Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret, when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you are doing these things, show yourselves to the world.'" Okay, from an earthly perspective, from an earthly messianic figure, this is good advice. They probably heard of Jesus' declining poll numbers, especially after the whole incident of the eating my flesh and drinking my blood. Many people left him, stopped following him, and they know that he will not gather the forces that he needs by staying in Galilee. Timing was everything. So they're suggesting that he show his miraculous works openly to your disciples meaning those Jews throughout the world who were gathered in Jerusalem, who had a positive disposition towards him, who would listen to him. They saw him doing miracles, and seeing that he was the earthly messianic figure, they would rally around him, have a huge force, and overtake. They would see the miracles, the signs, and thus those disciples, those who were hearing his teaching, would see and believe. We've seen that concept and that thinking already in the last chapter, where the people in the Capernaum synagogue said, so they said to him, "What then do you do for a sign, so that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform?" His brothers are in the same concept, the same ideas. Show your work, show your works, show your miracles, your signs. So his brothers are acknowledging that he's doing miracles, but they want him to be that earthly Messiah who would fight against the religious authorities. I mean, Jesus, and they have to know that the religious authorities are hostile. So if they're saying you need to come openly, it means, okay, let's go against them. Let's have a conflict there. So the fight against the religious authorities, Number 2, to overthrow Rome. And then number 3, to usher in that time of eternal material blessing of the kingdom. To have that second Exodus to which the Feast of Booths anticipates. So their emphasis is on do miracles in Jerusalem. Let's get the balls rolling here, and let's start a political movement. And in chapter 6, we saw the crowd did not believe him. But in chapter 7, we see that his own family, his half-brothers, don't believe him. They're not on the same page as Jesus. They're not hearing his message. And when we talk about his brothers, who are they? We're going to turn to Matthew. Tells us that is this not the carpenter's son? This is not his mother called Mary and his brothers James. Also, that word can be translated Jacob, but in our English text, it's always translated James. James and Joseph, we can call him JJ, which is Joseph Jr. Simeon or Judas. There's a name Judas, never heard of that one. Well, in Hebrew, it can be translated into Greek, it can be translated Judas, Judah, or Jude. We know him as Jude. Either one of them is a legitimate translation. So these are his brothers. That's their advice. It's great advice from an earthly perspective. But is that how Jesus is operating? Will he take the kingdom by force? Does he seek the approval of man? Is he doing these miracles to gain popularity? To this, John adds an editorial note to explain why his brothers are not on the same page. Verse 5 says, "For not even his brothers were believing in him." Now, brothers in that ancient culture were normally among one's closest allies. You trusted brothers. They were in the family. And brotherly ties were very important, and family conflicts were considered to be tragic. And they were seeking Jesus to carry out their plans, their expectations, rather than seeking to carry out his. They wanted an earthly Messiah, and they did not see a divine Lord. So we know that they did come to believe in Jesus as their Savior and as their Lord. For they were among the few, which is about 120, who were in the upper room in Acts, who initially received the Holy Spirit. Acts 1:14 says, "These all were of one mind, were continually devoting themselves to prayer, along with the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers." So they were there. Something happened between this chapter and in Acts chapter 1 that they turned and believed. And in fact, 1 Corinthians talks about that. 1 Corinthians 15, starting verse 3, it says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," meaning Peter, "then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time," that's in Galilee, "most of whom remain until now. Some have fallen asleep, some have died. Then he appeared to James," that's his brother. Then to all the apostles, lowercase a apostles meaning missionaries. That would probably include the rest of his brothers. When he appeared to James, that may include also his other brothers. But what he's saying is that his brothers did believe when they saw the risen Christ, when they saw their brother alive and glorified. And we know that James and Jude wrote the epistles that bear their names, and also that James was one of the leaders in the church of Jerusalem. So although they don't believe now, there's still hope. That's something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking with or know of other people around us that don't get it or are hostile to Christ, or non-believers. If they still have breath, it's not over. God can still work in their heart. And we need to keep that in mind. So that is a request of their brothers. Jesus' brothers urged him to be the Messiah they wanted, to enter Jerusalem publicly with miracles, to draw people to his side, and then for him to usher in the material blessings of the promised kingdom to which the feasts of booths anticipates. But this kind of entrance and these blessings, they're not going to come until Jesus comes the second time. The mission that the Father has given Jesus points him in a different direction. So now we move to Jesus' response. Verse 6 says, "So Jesus said to them, 'My time is not yet here, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that its deeds are evil.'" So Jesus starts off by answering saying, "My time is not yet here." Basically, go up to Jerusalem and openly presenting myself as the Messiah is not going to happen now. This is not the right time for it. If Jesus had followed their advice, it would have started events that would have led to his death now. But the timing for him to do this is the very next Passover. 6 more months. That's it. It's during that triumphal entry. That's what they want him to do here. But he knows he has to do it in 6 months. It's that triumphal entry that starts during that Passion Week, which is right before the Passover. And apparently the Father had revealed this to Jesus and revealed the timing, the proper timing to him. And thus he says, "I cannot go up yet, openly yet, because that'll start things that is not the right time. There's still more for me to do." And then he says, "But your timing is always opportune." Meaning, they can go up into Jerusalem freely. Doesn't matter if they go openly or in private, because they don't have a threat to their lives. Why is that? Because the world cannot hate you. Now that's a fascinating statement, because Jesus is saying they're part of the world. They're not believers. They're not saved. Thus, they are living and working within that false religious system of Judaism, of the way that Judaism was being presented by the Pharisees and the scribes. The brothers would have looked up to the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. And on the other hand, Jesus points out the inherent sin of the world to bring people to a place where they can see their great need for God's forgiveness and God's mercy. That's why when Jesus says it's not the healthy who need a physician, but it's the sick. Now, in reality, everyone is sick with sin. But Jesus is saying, if you don't realize you're sick, then you're not going to come to a physician for help. And so John earlier talked about this in chapter 3 when John, the gospel writer, says, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed." So that explains the mechanism of what's going on here, what Jesus is talking about. Those who are unwilling to humble themselves before God and seek his mercies will hate the light that exposes them. They will hate it because it shows their insufficiencies. And because they're unwilling to change and receive his forgiveness and receive his mercies, they're going to want to extinguish it because it hurts. It reminds them of their deficiencies. So because the world hates Jesus, he must be wise concerning how he interacts with it. And so he says, "Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time has not yet fully come." Jesus instructs them, go ahead and go on up in the caravan without him. Whenever they went to these feasts, they would go in large groups. Families, even whole towns would go all together for numbers, for safety. We get a picture of that in Luke. Do you remember when Jesus was a little boy and Mary and Joseph was already a day's travel on? They just thought Jesus was among their relatives. And then they realized, hey, where is he? And they had to go back. It's because they normally traveled in large packs, large groups, caravans. So here he says, you guys go up without me. He's separating himself from his brothers, from his family. It shows a disconnect between their ideas and his. The time for him to publicly present himself as Messiah has not yet come. What does that imply? It will come. Actually, we know it's going to come in 6 months, but not quite yet. So he's not going to go up to this feast openly, as they proposed. And since this feast requires for all Jewish males to come, his brothers would assume by his words that he's going to come up later. Not with the whole caravan, but would come up a little later. So then John informs us that having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. So from this comment, we can imply that the brothers, with the rest of the family in the town, they began that 3-day journey to Jerusalem. Which leads us to the second scene of hostility, which is the dangers in Jerusalem. So now as a recap, the brothers were not believing or understanding his current mission and purpose, and they were urging him to popularity and to a political movement, showing that they did not trust in him, but they tried to make him trust them. And thus, they had an unbrotherly invitation, not producing unity, but causing Jesus to have to separate from them. Okay, now this second scene describes the dangers in Jerusalem, which begins with the secrecy of Jesus. Verse 10 says, "But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as if in secret." Now when it says, as if in secret, he went up hidden from the public's attention. He would be known, and he went with his disciples. So he didn't hide it. He didn't try to hide his face and all the faces of the disciples so that no one would ever see him. He just didn't go up with grand banners waving, crowds cheering. He didn't go up in spotlights. He didn't make a grand entrance because he was trying to avoid the unwelcome publicity. He went privately. Notice the text says he went up not publicly. This is the exact opposite of what his brothers were suggesting. So he came in secret. Now why did he come in secret? Because the Jewish leadership wanted to kill him. Pure and simple. And as a side note, there's a sad irony here. Because the object of worship, which everyone throughout the empire is going to Jerusalem, the object of that worship could not openly go to the feast that was held in his honor. It shows the level of the nation and of its leaders. So his secrecy illustrates the level of danger in Jerusalem. The second indicator of danger is the hostility of the Jewish leadership. In verse 11 it says, "So the Jews were seeking him at the feast and were saying, 'Where is he?' Since the religious authorities were looking to arrest and to kill Jesus, John already told us that, they would be looking for him to come up to Jerusalem during the feast, the required feast, with his family, with the caravan, with the rest of the Galileans. And when the religious leaders' henchmen would go, especially try to intercept those who were coming in, and when they asked, 'Where's Jesus? Is he here?' They would have plausible deniability. 'Oh, he didn't come up yet. In fact, we left him in Galilee. We don't know where he is.' And thus, he could come in secret because no one knew where he was. So from this verse, two things are obvious. Number one, they were seeking to kill him, which was revealed to Jesus by the Father. Jesus knew this ahead of time, and thus he planned to go in secret. And then number two, they can't find him. This would have been frustrating to them, and at some point they would have called off the hunt. All right, we can't find him, or he's not coming. And it's fascinating because in the text, we're going to get to next week, as soon as that happens, boop, Jesus appears, starting to teach, just to get their goat. But that's next week. So, as far as they know, they can't find him. Where is he? But, however, although they can't find the physical Jesus, Jesus is there everywhere at the feast. Because we see Jesus present in the divided crowds. It says, there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying, he's a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads people astray. Now, because they were grumbling, John uses that word purposely to make a connection to chapter 6, the people in the Capernaum synagogue who were also grumbling about Jesus, whispering of disapproval and arguing among themselves. And it also links to the Exodus wanderings. And it shows that Jesus was the topic of the entire nation. And that the crowds were divided. On one hand, they were saying he's a good man. Now, when they say good, we don't mean like Texas, they're good people. It's not what we're saying. When they're saying he's a good man, they're saying he is good because he reflects the character of God. And thus his teaching, his actions, his behavior is godly. So some saw the Lord of Scripture revealed in Jesus. They knew the God that Scripture reveals, and they recognized it in Jesus. And some viewed him in the opposite manner. Some were saying, no, on the contrary. Quite the opposite. He's not a good man revealing God. He is, by implication, he's evil. And he leads people astray. He leads people astray from God's ways, from God. And that's a serious accusation. In Deuteronomy 13, and in other places, but here's a major verse. It says, but that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has counseled rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to seduce you from the way in which the Lord your God commands you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from among you. If they considered him to be contrary, to be leading people astray as a prophet, they were supposed to kill him, to purge that evil. Now it's fascinating and interesting that those who reject Jesus believe that he is leading people away from his own law, from his own ways. Now we know that reality. But if that's the reality, then what's going on here? In reality, what is Jesus actually doing? He's actually leading people away from the false, works-based religion that was propagated by the current Jewish leadership. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, who had made up a religion based on works and not the Scriptures, on faith and grace. It was a twisting, a perversion of God's ways. It's the doctrine of demons, designed to have man trust in his own abilities, trust in his own works, instead of putting their trust and their belief in God's graces. So this accusation, it continued in Judaism. In the 2nd century writing of Justin Martyr, who was a Christian apologist, when he's dialoguing with Trypho the Jew, it says, but though they, meaning the Jewish leadership, saw such works, in the context he's talking about miracles, they asserted it was magical art, for they dare to call him a magician and a deceiver of the people, yet he wrought such works. And this is evidence in later Jewish writings as well, that they interpreted Jesus as being a sorcerer, a magician of tricks, and thus a deceiver of the people. So notice in this passage here, in John's passage, there's only two options. It's either Jesus is either a good man leading people to God, or he's an evil man leading people astray and away from God. This passage is a great example of what C.S. Lewis verbalized, that Jesus was either Lord, liar, or lunatic. Now it's clear from the previous passage, and it's going to be clear from the passage as we continue on in this section, that Jesus claimed to be God. In fact, as this discourse goes on, before we reach chapter 10, they're going to pick up stones to stone him because they understand that he's claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God. So the question then becomes, is he? Well, one option is he's a liar. He's a deceiver. If he was a deceiver, what's his motive? He wasn't rich, and he wasn't powerful. In fact, he's losing followers. And we know that he was actually going to die. And would God bring about miracles, specifically the resurrection? No one else in human history was resurrected, but Jesus was. Would God do that for a liar? Another option is that he's a lunatic. He just was out of his mind, and he thought he was God. And in fact, they're going to say this. In John chapter 8, verse 48, they're going to say, you have a demon. You're a lunatic. You're crazy. And if he was crazy, if he had a demon, would he have followers? Would his followers see that he was nuts? And if they thought that he was crazy, would they then, after his death, commit their lives to his teaching? Throughout their whole life, persecution, going out throughout the whole world, and even all of them committed to even die for him? And again, if he was a lunatic, did everyone else see that? And we know from the text that he bested the religious scholars. Can a lunatic do that? And then, again, would God work out miracles and resurrect one that was actually crazy? The other option, and those two options, a liar or a lunatic, are really all one and the same. Because it's either, is he God or is he not God? And the other option is, well, he's really Lord. He's really God. So John ends this section with an observation that yet not one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. The people were not having an open debate because they were afraid of the retribution of the Jewish leadership against anyone who did not openly reject Jesus. And we're going to see that a little later. We're going to see their attack on someone who just says, hey, let's consider him. The Jewish leadership wanted to silence even the discussion about him. They didn't want any other voice motivating the people. Only their voice. They wanted only their voice to be heard. And we see that today in our society. We see the truth of God being not allowed, trying to be silenced. They only want the one drumbeat, the one false voice, the one false narrative, the false message, rather than a true discourse or dialogue, or knowing all the sides. And what this shows here, because the people knew, and the people were afraid, they must have unleashed their wrath on others. They must have seen someone being severely punished by the Jewish leadership that brought about fear. And thus, what this shows is that the Jewish leadership is no longer open to evidence. They are definitively against Jesus. And thus, they're against God. Which demonstrates the rising hostilities. Okay, let's move to applications. Number one, at this time, the brothers of Jesus were not saved and therefore looked at the world differently. They were seeking material blessings, which is the lust of the eyes. They wanted Jesus to take it by force, the lust of the flesh, and they thought Jesus needed to conform to their plans, the pride of life. Meaning, I know what's best. However, a disciple of Christ views things in the opposite manner. They're not ruled by material or earthly desires, and they are seeking to know and follow God's will, to be conformed to his will and to his image. Number two, we saw Jesus being rejected by many of his countrymen and many of those who were following him. In this passage, we see his own brothers do not believe in him and want him to do things their way, and thus causing conflict. Because of this, Jesus had to separate himself from them. When our neighbors or even our own family conduct their lives in a manner contrary to God's calling and urge us to join them, we must likewise separate ourselves and obey God. This does not mean that we are no longer in their lives, but while they have breath, there's still hope that they will turn to the Lord. Number three, as we live out lives that are obedient to Christ, our words and our actions will bear witness to those around us of their sin. This will either draw people to the answer of Christ that we have received, or incite their hatred. Since we will be hated, we must make wise choices accordingly. seeking to obey God and to avoid persecution when possible. I found this passage fascinating because Jesus does not just brazenly say, I don't care, they want to kill me, it's not my time, I'm going right up on in there. He acts wisely. Okay, it's not my time yet. I'm going to be wise about this. I'm going up in secret. And number 4, since Jesus claimed to be God, we all must evaluate if we believe him. Was he a liar? Was he crazy? Or was he really God? And if he is God, then we owe him our obedience, our love, and our lives. Okay, does anyone have anything else you want to add? Any applications I missed? Or any questions?